So those of you who have been so diligent as to stick around for this get to look at my beautiful title page, Implementing a Village. And this is really the payoff for everything that came before. Because implementing a village, that is like putting the NPCs and the quests into the game, is basically almost at the end of the entire pipeline in a project. Like only voice acting comes after, really, and QA. So to be able to implement all that stuff in a village, we need to have level design. So we need to have the exteriors more or less final. And also, importantly, the interiors. And of course, to have both of those, we need the 3D assets available. You can sort of hack it, like, and do some things using placeholders for the interiors, but that's not a good time. So ideally, you would have like more or less final design on the interiors as well, like Rose Grilla was just doing. And then the other side, of course, you also need the writing done. Huh? So the writing is in NPCs and dialogue, and not just like concepted or outlined, but like actually ready to go, like fully written out and ready to go into the game. And then ideally also any quests that are associated with the village. But if those are not ready yet for whatever reason, maybe not written yet, or they require stuff from elsewhere in the province that isn't available yet, then you can just then that can be delayed for later, if need be. So to sort of give a picture of what goes into a claim like this, implementing a village, and sort of demystify the process, I wanted to look at a case study for something I recently did for Rostria, namely a village called Eandor. And this is a pretty average village by most accounts. So it has a kind of a high number of 15 NPCs, but 4 of those are basically associated with the boat, and they leave town after their quest is done. So it's kind of a deceptively high number. There's 3 houses and then 2 other buildings that only have an exterior. So most of the NPCs are actually distributed across those 3 houses. There's one miscellaneous quest, which is like the kind of quest that only has objectives in your journal and is something simple like go fetch me these items or go kill that person, stuff like that. And then there's also one side quest, but that one hasn't been written yet, so isn't ready for implementation yet, which means less work for me at this juncture. So it's a bit of a relief. So just to give an idea of what I was given, like typically what you're given is a whole bunch of files in Google Drive, including the documents for all the NPCs, but also if they've been kind to you, you will also get some kind of overview document. So for Eandur, it looks like this, sort of like what are all the buildings, and then who lives in them, and then every NPC name also has a link that takes you to the document for that NPC. So that's very helpful to get an idea of like how big of a task it is beforehand, and to sort of show you around. So an NPC document, in this case, always begins like this. So there's there's like an outline, like what kind of person is this, and then what do they look like physically? What is their inventory like, their clothing, but also some items that they have on their person, and then some suggestions for a daily schedule that they have. And then below that is their dialogue. And then the document for the quest looks like this. And of course, for any writer, this is super familiar because this just follows our typical writing format, with some dialogue, some objectives, and the like. So this is the MISC task, so it's not too long, not too complicated. So it should be fine. So I'm gonna break this up into like a bunch of subtasks, forming the strategy. So the first of these you do want to do first. That's just creating all the data, the NPC records and then putting them all in the world, and then also setting up any of that extra data like locations and factions, just to have that in the creation kit so you can use them to reference each other in conditions and the like. And then the next steps after that can sort of be done in a free order, but this is sort of my preference, and I'll explain why a little later. Okay, and then of course it's very important to track your progress. So just to show how I did it, so we just have a Trello board for implementation, and here I just have a card for every one of these tasks roughly, just to sort of track that, okay, I have created this NPC, so that if somebody else needs to take over, that they know exactly what has been created yet and what hasn't, so that we don't double up, which is very important. So first of all, the NPC, like the general setup. So this is a nice little step where you can mostly turn off your brain, because it's really just following a checklist of tasks. And then hopefully your project will have some kind of documentation on what you should do. And these include like creating the base actor records, and putting them in the world and configuring them, and setting up locations and relationships, and also factions, and then also keys and the lock list, and then also a few other things like location ref types. So that's a whole bunch of stuff that most players don't even realize is there, but it's necessary to make this world function in interesting ways. And I'll just go through them kind of quickly, just to give an idea of what all this stuff is and what it does. So, of course, to put an NPC into the game, you have to make that NPC. So that's just in the actor list. And every named villager will be its own actor, obviously. And they follow this kind of naming scheme where it's simply their name, and because we have a mod, we put the prefix before it. So you typically want to assign like the correct race and gender, of course. And these kinds of named NPCs have to be flagged as unique for them to be selectable in all kinds of menus. And they must not have a template actor base, because that's usually used for leveled enemies like bandits and stuff to randomize their stats and their faces. But if you do it on an NPC like this, then a whole bunch of stuff breaks. So you don't want to do that. So for the face, right? So for their physical appearance, if you're lucky, then the writer will have already created this NPC's face. And how do they do that? You can actually, in Skyrim, you can use the like the character creator, like when you start the game, to just create whatever face you want. And then they can use the console command called SPF, I think it stands for Save Player Face, and that actually exports the face to a file with the extension .npc. And then, so a whole bunch of those were uploaded to the drive, and then I could just import them in the creation kit, and then I automatically just have whatever face they made. So I don't have to spend a whole bunch of time configuring their face myself, because I tend to like waste a lot of time on that. And if I'm impatient, I just sort of randomly flick the sliders from left to right, and then fix and if they then look like a monstrosity, I just fix it as best as I can. But the better result is really if the writer spends the time just creating that face, and I just have to import it. So then for the inventory, by default, NPCs are naked, and that's rarely a good option. So here you can select an outfit for them. But of course, if the project isn't at a stage where outfits are all set up correctly, then you may have to use some placeholders, and then make a note for somebody else to go over it later. And then in a different tab, you also set the stats, like what their skills are and what their level is. Because if you have like a warrior kind of NPC, then you will want them to be better at combat and to be like more of a challenge if the player decided to be evil and go killing people. And then it's time to put them in the world. So that's just like you drag one instance of that NPC in the world, and there can only be one, or stuff starts breaking in hilarious ways. And you should put them beside where they sleep, so usually a bed, because that helps with their daily schedules later on. And this is why you want the interiors ready, because if there's no interior, then you can't really put the NPC where they're supposed to be put, you know. So, but that's not all, because you also have to click on the NPC. Oh yeah, first this. So occasionally something can like go wrong, because there was a house that was supposed to have 3 inhabitants, a mother, a father, and then their adult son. But the closest thing that I found to a bed for the son was this rug on the floor that had a few toys around it. And I don't know who was supposed to sleep here, a dog maybe, but I just asked the level design lead and they were like, oh, whoops, my bad. So then I just went ahead and put a bed there myself using my extremely limited level design skills. So that's something that can happen. Like sometimes the level design isn't completely in tune with the writing, and then you sort of have to find the compromise. But in this case, it was a minor thing, so that's okay. So yeah, you have to open this NPC reference, give them a convenient editor ID so that you can find them again easily. But then very importantly, you have to go to the persist location tab and then give them a persistence location. So locations are for the next slide, but basically it's to make sure that whenever the player is anywhere in the village, that this NPC will be persistent. So they will be tracked in real time by the engine. So they will go about and do their business. Because if you don't set this, then they may never come outside their house, because the game doesn't actually load them in memory to run their daily routines and the like. So this is a very important thing. So locations. This is like the first of these extra bits of data that I wanted to talk about. So it's just an extra thing that is applied to cells. So you make a location like Ayandur location, and then cells in Ayandur, you can say they are in this location. But also you can make them a parent of each other. Huh? So in this instance, the kinds of locations that you need for a village typically are a main location that is supposed to span the entire village. So you apply that to all the exterior cells. So you see there in the cell view of the Roskrea world space, all the Ayandur cells have that location set. And I also gave them a nice editor ID, so it's easy to see at a glance, which ones are actually part of this village. And the locations themselves also have a list of like keywords that denote like what type of location it is. Is it a settlement, or is it a dungeon, or is it a city? Something like that. But then in addition to that, you also need one extra location for every building, at least the ones that have interiors. So for instance, there's a Blue Nail House, so that would be Ross Ayandur Blue Nail House location. And you specify that its parent location is the main village location. So that means it's still in the village, it's still in Ayandur, but it's also specifically in this building. So that helps with radiant quests and with all sorts of conditions. If there's if some kind of dialogue has a condition like needs to be in the Ayandur location, then you want it to still be valid if they are inside the inn or something like that. And this also has keywords saying it's a dwelling, like people live here, and in this case it's an inn. So yeah, that's because radiant quests, if we have them, can make use of this data. And then you also need to set up relationships for each pair of NPCs, or almost all of them. If there's like 2 NPCs who have absolutely nothing to do with each other, then maybe you can get away with not giving them a relationship. But if you don't give them a relationship, then they will basically never support each other in combat, as far as I know. So when you have a mother and the daughter, and you attack the daughter, you don't want the mother to just stand there and go like, oh, it's a fight. I'm gonna stay out of this one. Like, no, they need, like, you want the mother to just grab her sword and go into the fray. And that's what you do by saying, okay, these two people, they are allies and they have this kind of association type. In theory, Radiant quests can use them, but I don't think. I mean, I don't know of any examples where they are used in vanilla. Like, in theory, you could have a Radiant quest search for an NPC somewhere who has a secret lover, and then do some kind of generic quests where, yeah, but I don't think it's actually counter to the strategy that they ended up using in Skyrim, where there's no generic NPCs with these generic quests. So it's just a theory. Next up, factions. So factions control mainly dialogue, actually, but also crime and ownership, which you need to have so that the player can just take everything without it being considered stealing. So the factions that you will definitely need are one village-wide faction. So in this case, that's called Rosstown Eandur faction, that all these villages will have to be added to. There will have to be a faction for every house. You'll need to add the relevant crime faction, but their bounty, like if you commit crime against this person, then your bounty will be counted in this crime faction. And you have to also set it in the drop-down menu at the bottom. And then you also want to add if they're a service provider or a trainer, then you will want to give them the faction corresponding to that job, so that because their generic service provider dialogue will be conditioned on them being a member of this faction. So if the NPC is a member of the Ross job rent room faction, then they will have their rent room dialogue, like, I'd like to rent a room from you, 10 gold, that kind of stuff. So factions can also be owners of stuff, of items, but also cells. So for every house, you have to set the owner as to that house faction. So then everything in that house will become owned, and you can't just take it willy-nilly. But you also have to set it. Then you also have to set the faction as the owner on the inside of the door. And so a door has there's a door reference in the exterior world space, but there's another one on the inside and in the interior cell. So that one has to be set as owner. And if you don't do this, then the locking and unlocking behavior of the doors won't work properly, and the player will be considered trespassing even if they shouldn't be, that kind of stuff. You can also use that, village-wide town faction as the owner of any specific items in the exterior. So if there's something valuable lying around that you want to be considered as stealing if the player takes it, you just set the town faction as the owner, and you're done. And then lastly, lock lists, which is needed for some reason. So for this locking and unlocking to behave properly, of course, you have to set the doors as locked. You have to give them a lock. And then you have to give every resident a key, an instance of the key to that door. But then you also have to make a form list, and then put every resident into that form list, and then set that as, in the cell data, that this cell's lock list is this, in this case, the Eandur Blue Nail House lock list. It's needed. So just another thing to forget, possibly. But anyway, yeah, so that's most of the extra faff at the beginning done. So that's good. Completing this stage. It would be nice to actually send this in for a merge when you're done, because then all those records are in the build and other modders can access them, so that's pretty useful. Make sure it doesn't get lost. And then the next steps in theory can be done in any order, but I prefer to do it in this one because in order to do NPC AI, like configure their daily routines, it helps to be familiar with the dialogue, and you become familiar with the dialogue by implementing the dialogue. So I think it's good to do that first. And then quests. are easier to test when NPCs are fully functional with their daily routines and stuff. And it's also easier to sort of see how a quest might impact the daily ongoings on in a village. So yeah, I put that one last. So then for the second part, let's talk about dialogue. So a village will have one quest for all of the like non-quest related dialogue, which is a bit confusing terminology maybe, but like in Skyrim, all the dialogue is contained in quests, and like it doesn't have like quest in the broader definition, because quests are sometimes used for these playable things that have quest journals and the like, but there's also many other quests that simply exist for all sorts of abstract purposes, including here simply to hold dialogue. So this is like the village dialogue quests for all the daily non-quest related stuff. But there may also be some dialogue that leads to quests, and post-quest dialogue that like becomes available after a quest is done will also have to be done. Also have to be contained here, and I'll get to why a little later. But if we look at an NPC document, and so typically you would go through each NPC and then one by one implement their dialogue. So they often have some greetings, which is like a line that they speak when you initiate dialogue with them. They have their player dialogue, which is what you see in the dialogue menus, and that can branch and and the like. And then when you exit dialogue, they can say some farewells, and those will be in the document as well. And of course, some of them can depend on quest outcomes. So until those quests have been implemented, you sort of have to put them in without the correct conditions, and then make a note for later, and then not forget to hook them up after you've implemented the quest. So the greetings and the farewells are in the miscellaneous. Yeah, well, I'm not going to go too deep into the basics of dialogue implementation because that's not within the scope of this lecture. But you sort of all the greetings get piled into this one stack of this one like hello topic in the miscellaneous tab, and then all the farewells are piled into a different topic all in one stack as well. So these kinds of greetings, they use a reset timer, so that when you repeatedly talk to the NPC, that they will cycle through these lines, and then once you've heard them all in quick succession, they will drop down to their generics like, yes, need something? So that you don't repeatedly hear them say, sometimes I envy your kind, blah, 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 because that'll get old very fast. But of course, you don't want this flavor to disappear forever, so that's why they have a reset timer after a while. And there's also some NPCs that have only greetings, like Nazim. So these will basically deliver all of their content in just a few greetings. So, and then there's a player dialogue, and that's what every, if you do the Bindu Olo tutorial or whatever, you learn about player dialogue very instantaneously. So I'm not going to go too deep into this. You can do it using your preferred method. I am one of the apparently very few who enjoy using dialogue views, because the other implementation teachers like to take a dump over it. But if you use dialogue views, then one system that I've seen that I think works really well is to have one dialogue view per NPC, where you can sort of see what all their dialogue is naturally. So yeah, this is just for those not in the know, this is just an optional way of working with dialogue in the creation kit. This whole flowchart system, you don't have to use it, but it's there, and I use it. So yeah. So in this, a technique that was often used in this particular village, and we'll probably use throughout Roskra, I think is pretty good, is to have dialogue options unlock other options once they've been heard, rather than, let's say, putting more dialogue options as sub branches, so that you get this very deep branching thing where it takes a while to go through, and then because that can be very confusing and off-putting for the player. But there's no option for this in the CK integration kit. You cannot simply indicate in a creation kit like, oh, this branch unlocks this other branch. So you have to script it using Papyrus. And that means you have to arrange for something to hold this data. Like, is option 2 available? Yes or no? And then condition on that. So then what can you use? You can try using global variables, but then your implementation lead will probably yell at you because that's another object you have to create in the object window and use it. And having a lot of these clutters up and it becomes complex. So we don't want that. We can also have conditional script variables in the script and condition on that. Or in fact, we can use quest stages in the dialogue quests, and that's what I see used in vanilla quite a lot, and that's what I ended up using here. So since this isn't a normal quest in like the narrow sense of the word, where each stage would have some stuff happening and some dialogue and a journal entry or whatever, you can actually repurpose the quest stages to work as to control the dialogue. So which piece of dialogue is enabled and which one is not. So you would have like the last line of dialogue, you would add a script fragment to set stage 120. And then the dialogue branch that is unlocked by that, you would add a condition, get stage done 120 needs to be 1 or true. So that's basically, has this stage ever been set? Yes or no? So that, and then that it would be unlocked once it is set. But the downside is it can be hard to keep track of, like, okay, like 100 and which one was it again? 120 or 110? It can be kind of hard to keep track of what number refers to what dialogue. And I used the journal log entry to sort of document it there. In vanilla, they often use they have to put it as a comment in the script. But I've also noticed that the other implementation teachers really don't seem to like this for exactly that reason. So and also I like using dialogue view. So come at me, bro, I guess. But anyway, take it or leave it. So some NPCs have this initial conversation that they have with you on the first meeting. So this NPC, if you're an Argonian or a Khajiit, will basically say, "Oh, like, oh, what the hell are you?" Or like, like, "I've never seen something like you before." So you should implement this as a blocking branch. So in this document, they're called unique greeting, but it's not a greeting at all. It's a kind of player dialogue, but here you would do it as a blocking branch. Sometimes they'll say it has to be force greet. So force greet is basically the NPC will walk towards you and then pull you into dialogue forcibly. But for non-quest village dialogue, you don't want to do that because that's very invasive for the player. So a blocking branch is sort of like a more watered down version of that. It still works the same way, but the player has to initiate dialogue with the NPC. So that's what I did here. And sometimes there will be something, piece of writing that seems wrong. Like here is one issue that I saw, in fact, relating to this, initial greeting stuff, where I thought, this probably, there's a non sequitur here if the player does some other dialogue options first, or here's a different greeting and stuff. So, and you should feel free to just bring these kinds of issues up. So the neat thing is you are implementing documents that have been locked for implementation. So they've been locked. So no writers or editors are supposed to be, messing with it. But you as the implementer are privileged because you can propose changes to these documents because you may have encountered issues because you are still the person who's putting these into the game. So you arguably have the best. You're in the best position to spot these kinds of practical issues. So in this case, we came to a compromise, and the writing was indeed improved. And if you have a team that is sort of new at implementing content, then these kinds of exchanges can like bring new insight to the writers or like the main editor and stuff. So that actually helps improve future writing as well. So yeah, this kind of communication is very important. So that was one kind of dialogue. So in addition, there's also scenes. So scenes are these kinds of conversations that occur between two NPCs, or actually it could even be just more NPCs or just one NPC monologuing to themselves. So these, let's say, fall into two categories. There are random conversations, also known as ambient dialogue or ambient conversations or radiant conversations, or as they are written in that document, general city scenes. But they're basically all the same thing. They just get triggered randomly when two NPCs meet. And so they are always between two NPCs. And then there's major establishers or intro scenes or general establishers or something like that. And those are mandatory. So they always trigger usually at the start of the game, because they set the tone and like the main themes of a certain settlement. And then both kinds should have been extracted and collected into their own document, which makes it easier for implementation. So every village scene is in a separate quest, and then starts when the quest starts, and then when the scene ends, the quest also ends. So that makes it a bit, a bit easier to manage. That it's just every scene is in its own quest, and then every quest will only have that particular scene. So it's really just a matter of programming the scene correctly, and then just using the appropriate methods to start the scene, and then everything will take care of itself. So for random conversations, they use the story manager, and then the story manager is kind of an advanced topic in implementation, but the way it's used here is actually really simple. So there's this system, the actor dialogue story manager node. Basically, whenever two NPCs at any time walk in each other's vicinity, like close enough to possibly enter into a conversation, then the game will go through this node and then just cycle through all of the quests that are added to this node, and then seeing, is this one valid for this instance? No. Is this one valid? No. Is this one valid? No. Is this one valid? Yes. Because it has like the correct NPCs and like. And then it will start that quest. And then everything will be taken care of from there. So once you've made these scene quests, you'll want to add them to the story manager. And then also, if there's any extra conditions, like they need to be inside or they need to be outside, or that kind of stuff, it needs to be this time of day, then it usually gets added here in the story manager as well. But then checking whether it even, for a scene to occur between these two NPCs, like Reefder and Alfie, of course the two NPCs have to be Reefder and Alfie. And that is actually handled in the quest itself, because these aliases have some conditions. So they basically get data from the story manager, the first actor in the conversation and the second actor in the conversation, and then you have to check, are they both either Reefder or Alfie? Okay, then the quest can go ahead, and then the scene can take place. So for major establishers, it's a bit different. It's not so random. It's not so procedural. It's actually, of course, like I said, typically enabled at game start. So and it's manually choreographed. So I have to put in these manual, these AI markers saying specifically where every NPC should stand. And since it's start game enabled, basically these NPCs will go to their position and then just stay there forever and ever and ever until the player comes by and then sees the scene, and then they and then when the scene ends, they will break out and then start their daily routines, basically. And then often there will also be a trigger box surrounding this little area, so that they will only start their dialogue once the player enters within earshot, basically, because it's not a very good experience if the scene is already half done, by the time the player is able to hear the dialogue or see the subtitles. And then for those who are not familiar with how the scene editor, what it looks like, there's like an obligatory picture just to give an idea. It's just it's just a sequential thing from left to right. It's like from start to finish, and then at every phase there might be some dialogue, as you can see there. The greenish blue boxes are packages, in this case telling them to hold position at their at the specific AI marker that I put there. But that's everything regarding scenes. So then, in theory, after you've done all this, you've gone through all the NPC documents, implemented their dialogue, and you've done all of the scenes, then you're done with dialogue. Yes, excellent. So that's already quite an accomplishment. But of course, that's not all yet, because at this point, if you've done it in this order, then all the NPCs will be stuck inside their homes. They will never come outside, and all the doors will be locked. So they will be locked inside their own homes, which is great if you're doing a COVID simulator. But of course, we want some good old hustle and bustle in our village. So the next step is AI. And by this, I refer to the NPC's daily schedules. Again, insofar as they are not quest related. So just their bog standard daily routines are controlled by their stack of packages in each NPC's AI packages tab. So here is where it gets terrifying, because you need creative inspiration to pull this off correctly. So you have to configure their schedules in a way that conveys what they're supposed to be doing according to the writing. But you also have to, from a gameplay perspective, you also have to make sure there's enough activity in the town, that it feels alive, that there's a hustle and bustle, so that people are visibly and audibly doing their jobs, and that it's sort of a satisfying location to basically travel through. So here it would be best to plan the entire village at once to sort of distribute this activity in a satisfactory way. So that means giving everything another read, like reading the NPC outlines. And in this case, the writers have supplied a suggestion for their schedule, like what they do at times in the day. Sometimes there will be a specific hour specified, but in this case, there is actually... wakes up around 8 a.m. I consider these more guidelines than actual rules, because I think we as the implementers are still in the best position to know what basically works as a cohesive whole, and we also can do testing to sort of fine-tune things. But in any case, it's very useful for these things to be here. And I think in this case, the suggestions were all very sensible. So I think I incorporated all of them anyway, even though I probably didn't pick exactly 8 a.m. for him. But that's fine. And then you also have to just sort of keep a mental note, okay, how many people do what exactly? In this case, I think there were 3 people who work on the docks in this village. And then there's one sort of elderly person who oversees them. There's a smith, there's somebody who chops wood, there's an innkeeper, and so on. There's a guy in a watchtower who's keeping watch and then occasionally comes out of his tower to do to eat and sleep. And you should look at what the level designers did, because ideally they will already have designed the village with the writing in mind, so they will have put stuff around that you can make use of to convey what they're supposed to be doing. So first order of business is usually just plopping down all sorts of AI markers. So on the one hand, some of these AI objects will have already been placed down by level design, because that's like furniture, like chairs and crafting stations. But there's other kinds of quote-unquote furniture that you will have to place down yourself, because those are basically these invisible markers that include things like an NPC leaning against a wall or sitting off a ledge, stuff like that, where and they're furniture because the NPC has their position locked in place basically to do this animation. But then besides that, there's also idle markers for like examining something or wiping their brow or looking like far ahead, stuff like that. It fulfills a similar function, but it's implemented using a different kind of option. But then you also want to put down X markers, and X markers do nothing on their own, but they're basically just useful as things to point to when you make these AI packages. So basically, if you want to make a package that is intended like work after doc package, for instance, then you will want to point them to an X marker like this. And then the X marker will have a name like Aandor doc work marker or something like that. So it's simply something to point to when you want people to go to the docs and then sort of sandbox in the immediate area. But of course, knowing like deciding like what markers to put down depends on your knowledge of the available animations, because they often won't fit exactly what you want to do. So then it's basically advised to have a good knowledge of like what everything is, just have a look over, and then try to find suitable proxies to sort of evoke what they're supposed to be doing. And in vanilla, this is used a ton as well. Like imagine like we have people who work at the docks, but there's like what kind of dock working animation do we have? Because we cannot have people pick up crates and move them around. That's not an animation that we have. We cannot have them pull on ropes for like a pulley system. We don't have that either. So then what can you do? Well, I put down a few searching chest idle markers besides some of the the crates and the bags that have been stacked up, which means they will go over there and then sort of crouch down in front of it and then hold out their arms a little bit. So it seems like they're quote unquote like handling the cargo, or at least inspecting it a little. If you actually stop to think about it, then the immersion will be ruined, but it is, in my opinion, a serviceable way of evoking like the idea that they are handling some cargo and like working at the docks, and that should be enough. Let's say, like the picture here is actually from vanilla. It's Gallant Saltsage, and he supposedly works on the boat that takes you to Solstheim, but he really just like hammers, like just hits a hammer on the mast all day, which doesn't really make sense. Like how does that actually help? But it evokes the feeling that they're working on a boat, that they're maintaining the ship, so that'll have to be enough. And there's all sorts of other kinds of markers that you can put down. So here, that's the wrong one. So here's the guy in the watchtower, and I basically put down some idle markers for looking far ahead and that kind of stuff in different orientations, so that he every so often changes the direction he's looking at. So it's a bit more of an interesting side than if we were just standing in one place looking in one direction all the time. All right. So one useful feature with markers is that you can set them as owned, and then whoever owns that marker is the only person who can use them. So in this case, this is the wall lean marker from earlier, and I set that as owned by this overseer NPC. So not the person doing the work, but the person who's sort of like overseeing it. And so just to make sure that none of the actual dock workers will actually like start using this marker, and then it'll be as if they're slacking off, but that's not the intent. That's not the intention. So you can have a specific NPC be the owner, or also a faction. And then one important thing is in beds, in houses, the owner has to be whoever sleeps in that bed. But then some beds are like double beds where a couple will sleep in them. So then the owner will have to be a faction. And then sometimes the only option to get it right has to be making a new faction specifically for that bed, which sounds a bit silly, but that's just how it has to be. Simply like the Ross Aandor Blue Nail House double bed faction of who gets to sleep in the big queen-sized bed. So then, assuming you have the markers more or less placed down, then time has come to start giving them packages. So start filling out each NPC's package stack. You should give them as many default packages as possible. So default packages are these sort of prefabricated, reusable packages for sleeps from this hour to this hour or eating at a certain hour. And they typically use the editor location or sometimes current location. So the editor location is the location where you put that NPC down in the creation kit. So that's why it was important to put them in their house next to their bed, so that they, when you give them a package like a default sleep editor location, that they will look for their bed near where they were placed in the world. But then everything else, when you want them to do something at a certain location in the village, or you want to put them on a certain schedule, then you have to make a new package. This particular NPC doesn't have many interesting packages. She's basically a whaler that's off on shore leave, so she just spends the day drinking at the inn. But the dock workers will have a package for working at the docks, or a merchant will have a package for tending to the counter. And like I said, these typically point to X markers, but you can also reuse them among village NPCs. So all of the dock workers have this dock working package, so that the reason is you don't want to basically clutter up. Don't want to clutter it up with like dozens more packages than you actually need, because that makes things more confusing. It increases complexity, and it'll not be very nice if you or somebody else has to come back and then fix some bugs or tune some things. So packages use a template, and then one template that I found very useful is sandbox multi-location. Basically saying it's a sandbox package. So the basic idea is you go to a place and then near that particular spot, but location you can have them randomly cycle through a couple of different spots. So this is the dock working package. I put down three X markers that they will cycle through. So they go handle the cargo over there in the bottom right, and also like hammer at the pulley system. So they, instead of actually using the pulley, they'll be hammering at it, which is the best we can do. And then sometime later they can go up to the tanning rack and use that for a while, or they can go over to the bottom left and then tend to that cargo or sit off the ledge. And that gives some nice traffic where they're walking back and forth, which really helps. And also, it's some nice variety where they're not all at the same place, but they're also not all at different places and the same place every time, that kind of stuff. And they're also often used to cycle between some outside location and some inside location. Not for these particular dock workers, but an NPC could sort of go outside, sandbox near their porch, sweep it a little, and then they could go to their inside location and sweep the floor there, or have a drink, that kind of stuff. So that induces some nice traffic in and out of the house. So very importantly, crafting stations don't exist just to just to be usable by the player so they can sharpen their tools or whatever, but they also have some much needed ambience, because when NPCs use them, they produce noise. And you are probably already all familiar with that noise. I don't know if you can hear the stream audio, but you can imagine what it sounds like. So the audio that they produce, I don't know if you've ever paid attention, but there's actually different sets of audio when you're close and when you're far away. So that sort of reverberates, and you can feel from a distance that there's activity in that village. And it's never ambient noise. It's always noises made specifically by these NPCs as they're using these crafting stations, which I find pretty cool. And the result of that is that you do have to set them up to use these crafting stations, because it would be a shame. The level designers put all this stuff here, and then for you not to use it. So it's good. And then another package that is maybe often overlooked but very useful are these sort of carry packages. So I noticed there's this NPC who, that was written earlier, who chops chops firewood outside the inn. I noticed the level designer put this cutting stump, I don't know what you call it, on the left hand side of the inn, and then on the right hand side there's this little shed with like the firewood piled up. So I thought, why not have a routine where this person carries some of that firewood around the inn and into the shed, which is again nice traffic. It's nice to see them holding something like this in their hands and then sort of being able to pass them by. So I won't go into specifically how it's implemented, but you need to have a start furniture where they pick up the wood, and you need to have an end piece where they drop the wood down. So I had to add those, and then that results in a nice little routine where they sometimes just walk around the inn, and not without reason. So yeah. Some final remarks. You have to remember that NPCs need time to go from place to place. So in like earlier in AF Bates' presentation, if you have a spreadsheet like saying at this hour they do this, at this hour they do this, okay, that's all well and good. But if they need to do something at the other end of town, then it could take them a whole in-game hour to even just get to that point. And if by then they need to do something else, then they basically didn't get the chance to do their intended activity. So then it's up to you to come up with a better solution. And you also should make sure that all of the random conversations that have been written can actually happen, because it's entirely possible that you program these NPCs with routines so that they never encounter each other, and then they won't have the chance to get into a conversation with each other, and then basically the writing is just wasted. Vanilla is full of these. Beyond Skyrim, Bruma also has a few of these, so that's always unfortunate. And then there's many other subjects that I didn't get to, like merchant packages and locking doors, and then whatever else. But we only have so much time. But also wanted to highlight a specific thing that I improvised. So there was a campfire in the middle of the village that none of the writing documents actually used. So I thought, why not have a routine where everybody just sort of sits around the fire and has lunch, which is a nice opportunity to create some ambience, and then also more opportunities for these NPCs to talk to each other if they have conversations. But I also thought it might be a bit overbearing if this happens every day, because again, it takes quite a chunk out of their daily routines for them to just stop what they're doing and then slowly walk over to the campfire. So I made it so that it only triggers once every 2 days. And so packages can be configured to only occur on some days of the week, and there's a nice preset for it to be on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. So that's what I chose here. So if the player is here for a couple of days, and on some days they might see this happen, and on other days they might not. So I thought that was kind of neat. So yay, we finished the AI markers, the packages, and everything like that. So then all we really have left is the quests, and I'm not going to talk a lot about those because it's just it's just the theory of quest implementation, not really within the scope of this presentation. But I do want to highlight a few things. Like, as always, you want to ensure good encapsulation so that everything or almost everything related to the quest is contained in this quest. In this case, it's the miscellaneous task. And you do at some point want to use the stop command to actually stop the quest. So there's one thing, like you can complete the quest at a certain stage where all the objectives are completed, and the quest log will say, quest completed, but the quest will still be running in the background. So all of the data will still be kept and all the dialogue in the quest will still be available. But at some point you want to put in the command stop, and that'll clear everything out basically. So everything, all the aliases get cleared out, and all the dialogue will also no longer be available. So that's kind of a step that helps keep the game clean, And then you also want to provide a failure stage, even if the writers haven't specified it, because it's Skyrim, people can die randomly, quote unquote. Totally had nothing to do with the player. And then if an important NPC that is needed for the quest dies, then you want to automatically fail all the objectives and stop it. But a consequence of this is if the quest stops running at a certain point, then any dialogue in that quest will become unavailable. So if you have any post-quest dialogue, it should go in the main dialogue quest, because that one will never stop running. It'll always be available. It'll always be running. So yeah, that's why you put the post-quest dialogue there. So yeah, let's imagine that you completed the quest, then you're basically done with your claim, or at least anything you can do at this particular junction, because almost always there's something that you cannot do yet because not all the outfits were made yet, so somebody has to go through and assign those afterwards, or some of the dialogue depended on the quest that hasn't been implemented yet, something like that. So you should make a note of that somewhere. And then at a later stage, somebody can go through them and then hook everything up if it's available. But then the most fun thing, of course, is to share this progress with your team. Because in my experience, people really, really love when they see when they see the content implemented, because it's really the stage where it really flips the switch. Where before you may have had some pretty stuff, like a nice level design showcase, but that was really just empty, non-interactive content. But then after you've been through, then suddenly it's a world. There's dialogue. It's a mod all of a sudden, and people really like seeing that stuff. So you will get many accolades. Like I think writers in specific tend to get all giddy when they see their characters be brought to life in the game. But as you can see, it's not just writers that get excited. So I think this for me is really the biggest joy of being an implementer. It's like helping these, all of this content, the interactive part, the part that makes the mod interesting, actually be put into the game. So it ties everything together in a nice bow, and everybody sees the fruits of what they've been doing in the other departments. So yeah, that's basically all I wanted to talk about. Haven't left much time for questions, but I'm available as long as you are. So yeah.
All right, we got a question already. By the way, virtues of being the last lecture, you get to have as much time as you need for questions.
Yay.
So Lizard asks, first of all, thank you so much for your talk. This is wonderful insight into the process. I have a couple questions. One, is there a limit to how many persistent NPCs you can have?
So I don't worry about it super much, because the game has tons and tons and tons of persistent NPCs anyway. It doesn't take much for an NPC to be persistent. If they are in an alias, they're already persistent. If they are, if something else points to them, to their reference, like a linked reference or something, they're already persistent. But we sort of have to try not to make NPCs persistent without reason, basically, because it's possible that things might start adding up eventually. But I've personally never, I wouldn't even know how you would notice in game that there's too many persistent NPCs. It seems a little trite for it to just be frame drops, so it's not really something I'm actively worried about. Mostly it's just don't make them persistent if there's no particular reason for them to be. And then the other question is, how much time do you spend to fully implement any given area, and how do you organize your time around all these tasks? I think I work very slowly, because I also don't do claims all that often, to be perfectly honest. But once I do, I just work kind of intensively at it for a couple of weeks, and then and I try to hand it back as soon as I can. But then other people, they just take the claim, and then in 2 days, boom, they're done. And I don't. That's not me. So it can actually go very fast, faster than most other departments. I think implementing a village takes much less time than actually writing it, let alone writing plus level design and stuff. So it's actually, I think once the project gets to a stage where a lot of implementation claims become available, it can actually go pretty fast. because there's many people who can implement this kind of content like really quickly. All right, that's all the questions you have.
Anybody else have questions for implementation? Are there any writers out there? We saw a lot of writing implementation. Any writers have any questions?
I mean, I have questions related to my specific writing claims, but like that can be saved for like the actual dev chat stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was really insightful, and I really enjoyed learning about the behind-the-scenes process of taking the writing that a writer works on and putting it in the game. Like, I really like seeing that stuff.
Thingy, do you have any small joys that you see in writers' work that you feel like not enough writers do a lot of, that you wish you saw more of?
Personally, what gets me really excited in my experience is, I think in case of Cyrodiil specifically, is when some NPC talks about folklore or like superstitions relating to their specific area of Cyrodiil that they live in. I had it with like the Bosmer lady in Fairgill, where she's like, "Oh, the spirits of the West Weald," because we've never had somebody in Oblivion talk about the West Weald that way. Or even like all of the stuff that you have in Nibene. But I realize that's sort of specific to, I guess, yeah, I mean, that's more of a sort of style of writing thing than anything related to implementation. But like, I think it is interesting because I also find implementation fun because I get to get acquainted with the dialogue while I'm doing it, because I can't really be bothered to just sit down and read writing documents for no particular reason. But once I'm implementing them, I'm reading them anyway, and sort of getting to grips with it that way. And there's it's always like nice to read what people have come up with.
I actually do have a question that might relate to it. So, in NPC documents, it's pretty common to have like an NPC schedule segment. And I've noticed, at least in projects, where sometimes people will write like an actual like in-game time for each individual task, versus others will just write a list of the tasks that happen in the day and leave it to an implementer. Which do you think is more reasonable to do?
I think usually I'd say the latter case, because pardon my impudence, but if you write these specific times everywhere, I think the implementer is going to sort of fudge them around a little anyway, so it seems a little like wasted effort. But on the other hand, it can also, I mean, it can always help as a suggestion or sort of like a starting point. So if the writer wants to put them there, then they can, I suppose. I don't think it's definitely not mandatory, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, and on that note, would it just be simple like saying like in the earlier part of the day they do X, in the later part they do Y, or something like that?
Possibly.
Would that be like the best of both worlds kind of thing?
Possibly.
All right, thank you.
What was your favorite NPC in your project? Oh boy. I have to think, because I did some maybe the High Rock NPCs from back in 2013. My first NPCs. No, I don't know. I don't know. I really like that Bosmer lady. But like in terms of an NPC that has like interesting behaviors and stuff. I don't know. I'd have to think about that. Requirements, because I'm lazy and I just like and I don't, and if they have complex behaviors, then it's more likely to have bugs, and I don't like bugs, so I'm probably not likely to pick one of those NPCs as my favorite. How do you keep your writers from writing conflicting lore, both in terms of one another and the established lore? Yeah, that's up to the writing leadership, basically. I don't know any about that. I don't know. I mean, I don't like getting into lore. I'm just a lore dum-dum. I like nice forests for my Skyrim character to walk through. That's what I'm in it for. So I'm not the person to ask. Probably, I mean, there's probably implementers who are very, very opinionated on lore, but I'm not. So yeah, that's up to the writing lead to manage that.
Yeah, Matanak, that's going to be a lot more of a of the writing lead question. Usually you want to stay as consistent as possible, and it's kind of like how Bates and Nit were saying. Finding a writing buddy is really powerful, or at least just staying in tune with your regional chat of the writing area you're working on. Yeah, at some point an editor is going to go by, and you don't want them to have to check more than they have to.
And I'm actually going to see if I can get a writer buddy for Miyashikal, because, man, I need that.
Yeah.
It's been painful for the last year, it feels like.
Villages are usually going to be solo for sure. But there are, like for instance, the surrounding area, there's still a lot of lore you can be hip to, and just find somebody who's working in that region and just say hey, how are you doing some days, and eventually just start working like that.
You know what's actually painful that I learned about the whole thing? So you know how it's kind of weird how for my first claim they're like, okay, here's a whole town with 2 quests, a follower, and a bunch of NPCs and all that? Apparently, so he described, when I was given it, it's like, okay, here's the plans for the town, it's going to have this, 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 and this. Go edit. He didn't clarify that apparently I was only supposed to write the town followers and not worry about the quests or any of that, and never clarified. So for the last year, I've been overachieving the whole time.
I guess I do want to sort of go on a little tangent, because in my humble experience, I think city implementation is really just the same as village implementation, but just on a bigger scale with some more stringent requirements for project management. So it sort of feels like the same. It's basically divided into the same tasks, except there's many more NPCs, so Trello becomes kind of unwieldy to track every NPC in checklists that way. So we more often resort to spreadsheets where you can say for each NPC they have, okay, their base record is created, yes. Do they have dialogue? Yes. Their AI packages? No, not yet, and that kind of stuff. And it's also more often it'll work kind of non-linearly. So instead of waiting until every piece of writing or every interior is finished, implementation can go ahead on the NPCs and buildings that are ready, and then that'll get tracked. And then later on, some of those other NPCs will get their implementation once the time is right. And also, more typically, there will be more than one implementer working on a city as long as they coordinate well, or they will sort of pick up after each other. So yeah, like in my feeling, it's sort of like a village is sort of a microcosm of what it is of what it's like to implement a city. Most frustrating thing you've had to implement and why? So let me give you a little story. So there was this marriage quest in Bruma. So I worked on Bruma in like late 2013 and early 2014. And that involved like the marriage quest, where this NPC from Apple Watch needs is feeling lonely, so you go and scout out a girlfriend for them, and then eventually that leads to their marriage. And there was this really complicated logic needed for scheduling the wedding date. So what I really wanted was we want to wait until the Sunday, the week after, no, the next most Sunday. And that means you have to do a lot of mathematics with some global variables that track the time. Like you have to take the number of game days passed and then divide it to get the specific day of the week. But I was hacking at it back then all those years ago, and I just couldn't get it to work. And then I sort of stopped working on Beyond Skyrim because I met my boyfriend, and that was much more interesting than than spending time in a creation kit working on a video game mod project. And then whoever came after me, there were like 2 implementation leads after me. They tried fixing this quest, but they too could not hack it because the state I had left it in was just apparently so unworkable, so it didn't make it into the release. So then all those years later, in 2020, I was slated to marry my boyfriend, but then COVID hits and it's canceled, and I get stuck indoors, and I feel like playing Skyrim again, and then one thing leads to another, and I end up wow, Beyond Skyrim, wonder how they're doing, and before I know it, I apply and I'm back into the project. So what's the first thing I do? I'm back at work on this freaking marriage quest. So basically, it's God punishing me because I didn't put in the time to give Benuni Alfena his marriage. So that means I won't get to have my marriage either until I go in and fix this marriage quest. But eventually, I did. But we also sort of relaxed the specifications. This thing with the Sundays, just put it like 14 days in the future. That's fine enough. So that's what we ended up doing, and it's now slated to be included in the full Cyrodiil release. So finally, a happy ending. I still need to get married though, but we're gonna work on that. But yeah.
Anybody else have any implementation questions for Thingy at all? If you do, you can also feel free to message, and please use the Quest and Dialogue or any of the CK chats. Yeah. And teachers like Thingy, they will be there to answer your questions as well.
So yeah, thanks for coming to my TED Talk.